Hi, I'm Scott at ediblemusic.com. Having an understanding of routing within your workstation is important, not just because it will help you to navigate the workstation itself, but because it gives you a lot more power over your mixing process. You might be familiar with the basic setup of having a track that receives an incoming sound, maybe MIDI or a recording or a sample. And from that beginning point, it goes through the channel and out to the master channel, which is sort of like its terminal point. But between those, there are a lot of things that you can do, and I want to show you how to do some of them. In addition to that basic setup of having a channel that receives an input from a sound or from some MIDI information and then outputs to the master, you may also be getting some familiarity with return channels, which is where you can split or copy a signal coming out of a channel and send it also to, say, for example, a reverb or a delay or maybe some parallel compression or saturation, whatever kind of effects you might want to add to it. The return channel is not an audio track itself, but it is an additional point of intersection where the signal will come out of the channel and then will be sent on its way to the master, but will also have a copy of it sent through the return channel. And then from the return channel, that affected signal will itself go into the master. So then all of a sudden you'll have two channels that are outputting into the master. You can do this with a number of return channels, and you can send them from a track simply by specifying where you would like it to go. So here, for example, this third audio track would send to this reverb track. And then you have control over that channel. And from the reverb, it would go to the master. And this might be all you need to worry about if the orchestration or the program that you're working on has just a few tracks that you need to worry about. But as soon as you start adding more tracks like drums, a number of different instruments, multiple vocal tracks, then you'll want to start using what are called groups. And what groups do, for example, with this drum group here, is all of the tracks that are included in the drums here in red will route first through this drum track and then through the master. This gives you a lot of control over whatever you have selected to be in within that group. You could have individual processing on the kick and the snare and the overheads in the room, but then as they are all collected to this new point of intersection that is the drums group, then you can add some additional processing, maybe some collective processing on the drums with compression or some saturation. And then from there, it will go to the master. So having that additional point of intersection allows you to collect all of the individual tracks within that group and add some additional work on it that you might need to do that you can't do quite so easily if you were to just add it to each individual part or each individual program element within that group. For example, if you wanted to add some parallel compression to the drums, it doesn't really help to add parallel compression to each individual part of the drums. You want to have them all together already. And so then you would send from the group track to the parallel compression, which I've done here on this A return channel. An additional benefit of using groups or buses like this is that it really simplifies visually the organization of your mix. So I've got all these drums collected into this drum track, and I've done the same for guitars and keys and all of my vocal tracks as well. If I were to not be using groups, then it would look like an enormous session. But if I want to keep my focus on only the program elements that I'm working on at a time, then I don't want to have the distraction of having to scroll through the entire session. I can instead collapse things, keep them nice and tidy, and only open up the tracks that I'm working on presently. Now, a great way to think about this is like a funnel. At the very top, the widest part, you will have all of the individual channels, but they'll gradually funnel down and narrow the routing all the way to that singular point of the master at the very bottom of the funnel. An additional benefit to using this sort of funnel system or this grouping system is that if you've got all of your drums balanced nicely together, for example, but they're not quite balanced well with the rest of the mix, then instead of having to select and adjust all of the individual faders, because the drums are going through this next point of intersection of the drums group, you can just adjust that one fader, and all of the drums collectively will either raise or lower their volume as you adjust it in order to get it balanced better with the rest of the mix. It's very useful, and it makes things simplified much more for you. It gives you a lot more power over the balancing process between not just the individual parts of a group, but also as that group fits into the rest of the mix balance as well. But I want to suggest that you add an additional part to this funnel where you've got the individual tracks heading into groups. Then I also want you to think about adding an additional set of buses for the drums as a whole, for the instruments as a whole, for the vocals as a whole, and the effects as a whole. So not only will the individual tracks head into a group, the groups will then also be grouped together and head through an additional bus. And from there, it will go into the master. Why would you want to do this? In part, it's because if you're having trouble identifying something that is bothering you in the mix, if there's some muddiness or some harshness going on, if you have this additional set of buses that have collected an even larger group of tracks together, then you can very quickly mute that entire group and determine and deduce whether or not that is indeed where the problem is happening. Or, for example, if you just need to hone in on something that's very specific, then you can turn those group channels off just for a moment and give your focus entirely to the group that you need to be giving your attention to. And then from there, those new collections will head into the master. These groups as well, you can add a little bit of processing if you need to. For example, something that I like to do is once I have my drums grouped, my bass grouped, I'll send them to the rhythm section, and I'll then add a little bit of processing there. For example, some additional really light compression or some saturation. And I might add a different flavor of saturation on each of these 4 groups. Now you can think about organizing the routing of your mix project in ways that will really simplify things for you, but also open up some new opportunities. If you have grouped tracks that are similar to one another, again, such as drums or all of the guitars, then you can add some EQ boosts in order to help them fit better into the mix and gel better with the rest of the program elements. And you can save the individual processing for some more sort of cleanup work that you might need to do on them or to get them sounding solid first. Whereas then the next groups will be able to have some slighter processing that's more flavorful and it is more about just adding some smaller touches in order to get them to fit better with these other groups. But you will probably find that having this funnel shaped idea and applying it to the way that you route your mixes will be a really empowering way to not only organize the mix session that you're working on, but to have things sectioned out so that you can balance the drums and then worry about balancing the drums with the rest of the mix. You can balance and pan and process the guitars and then worry about having all of the guitars balanced with the rest of the mix. It's sort of like having little mixes within mixes, or they're otherwise called submixes, which is, I think, an applicable term. But having that approach will really give you an opportunity to explore new ways of processing not just the individual parts of a mix, but also thinking about the mix as a collection of groups. And then from there, it will head out into the master. Try this out. I think you'll have a great time with it. You can customize things as you need to, but sort of maintain that principle of having a funnel-shaped mix that will come from the individual tracks first and then head out through the master. And in between, you can set up all the points of intersection that you want You can make it as complicated as you want, but keep it simple at the beginning by just grouping similar instruments or similar program elements and then having them come together into the next group and the next group and then out as a complete song. Try it out.